Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hi, I'm Kevin Bayuk, a partner and worker owner at Lift Economy. My guest today is David Jaber. David is the founder of Climate Positive Consulting, a firm that helps companies advance climate strategy, carbon footprint analysis, and greenhouse gas reduction. Over the last 20 years, David has worked with over 150 companies to advance environmental excellence, including a diverse set of clients such as Cliff Bar, PG&E, HP, Danone, EcoCity Builders, and Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, amongst many others. David was a director at Blue Star Integrative Studio, a full-service planning and architecture firm which has an impressive design and planning project portfolio, especially some of the work with tribal nations and communities. David and I also had the pleasure of working together at Project Drawdown, where he is a fellow. David also does work locally in his community. He's a founding board member of one of my favorite projects in the world, the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, a democratic, people of color-led cooperative that takes land and housing off the speculative market to create permanently affordable, community-controlled land and housing. David's the author of a recent book, The Climate Positive Business: How You and Your Company Hit Bold Climate Goals and Go Net Zero. I think it's one of the most comprehensive yet still succinct books to cover kind of the range of both actions and the need for action in the business community to address the existential crisis of our time in climate change and global warming. I'm very excited to have David with his breadth of experience and background here on Next Economy Now. David, welcome to the podcast.
A pleasure to be here with you, Kevin.
I'm wondering if we could start with a little of your story. I'd love to kind of just know what your path is that got you into the work that you're doing today.
Sure. I would attribute my entry point into climate consulting probably starting even when I was a child, just really developing an appreciation of nature and wildlife. I feel fortunate to have grown up in a rural area where built environment was minimal, so other environments could thrive. So those interests, I think, kind of carried through. But I have to say, it didn't deeply influence my educational path as I went to school for chemical engineering. But what it did do in college is I got involved with environmental issues and ended up serving as the president of the environmental club. So I was following those two paths in undergrad. And in doing so, it became clear that my path was not going to be in manufacturing chemicals. I ended up going to grad school for environmental engineering. And for those that aren't that familiar with environmental engineering, basically you get trained to clean up pollution, whether that's in soil, air, or water. And if you work in that field for a while, maybe as a technician, you might often run into problems that are pretty intractable, like pump and treat systems that are supposed to clean groundwater, and they might be operating for a decade and still not kind of cleaning up the water to be levels that are going to be protective of human health. And in seeing some of these issues that didn't really have a satisfying resolution, it gave me the genius idea that maybe we just shouldn't pollute in the first place. So that was relatively early in my career. And I started gravitating toward this field that I was just noticing taking shape. And some people were calling it pollution prevention. Some were calling it green business. Others are calling it sustainable business. But the core of it was just working with companies to eliminate material wastes, improve energy use, green operations, and improve climate performance. And so my primary line of work now is founder of Climate Positive Consulting. And so Climate Positive and its predecessor firm have been around for 12 years, helping companies advance climate strategy, carbon footprint analytics, and greenhouse gas reduction. And we work primarily in North America, and that's mostly US and Canada. And across a range of industry sectors, food processing and manufacturing tend to be significant just because manufacturing tends to have a pretty larger footprint. And a big portion of that effort is promoting science-based targets, among other climate goals, but maybe we can get into that a little later.
This term climate positive in the title of the book, I imagine it's probably intuitive to some listeners as to what that means, but they might be more familiar with terms like net zero or zero carbon or climate neutral. I'm wondering if you could kind of walk us through, like, how do we get to climate positive? How should we understand the terminology here?
Sure. And for anyone who that's not intuitive for, I don't think the problem's with you. There's a wide range of terms that you'll see businesses talk about their goals. As you were just saying, Kevin, there's net zero, there's carbon neutral, there's climate positive, there's net negative. The list just tends to keep growing. As I would define it, a climate positive business is one that has a net zero goal, but it's one that's coupled with a science-based target. It also goes beyond net zero. So it's seeking to have some sort of positive benefits through its efforts to reduce greenhouse gas reduction. There are ways to find synergies between reducing greenhouse gases and other things we would consider benefits, like restoring habitat, advancing climate justice, or just providing other value than simply balancing out the greenhouse gas mathematics. And that's how I define it. Maybe I'll just take, because we were just talking about terminology, let me maybe go in depth a little there. As net zero, the sense there is that you're drawing as much carbon out of the air as you're putting into the air. One way that could be done is with, you have your operations that are emitting a certain amount of greenhouse gases. One way to look at that is doing offsets and kind of simply offsetting through planting trees or other ways to like take carbon out of the air. Another way at a building level for net zero is with basically making the building really efficient. You kind of, maxing out the amount of solar that you can produce there. So at some parts of the year, you're producing more solar energy that you can use and you can actually push it back into grid. And that's sort of a form of an offset. And that's what offset kind of the extra energy that you need to use kind of during maybe the colder and less sunnier parts of the year where you need to take energy from the grid. But it's basically a balance. So net zero and carbon neutral, I would essentially treat as equal. And then a lot of the other terms, they're actually not much different. Climate positive, carbon negative, net negative, because they're not well defined. So if you're just doing a little more, if your greenhouse gas footprint is 10,000 tons and you offset that and you offset 10,001 tons, in theory, that could be carbon negative or net negative or climate positive. But since there's not a definition, they're roughly kind of the same thing. And the sense, again, just that you're creating kind of a net climate benefit by your presence as an organization.
Perfect. And I appreciate you walking us through the terminology. I think there is a semantic kind of turf war, companies making lots of different claims and setting different targets and different standards bodies. So it's very helpful to have an expert guide us through it. Speaking of terminology, I want to return to offsets in a moment because that's part of your book. And you and I have discussed this a number of times, and it's on the mind of a lot of people. But before we get to there, I did want to stick with terminology for a moment just so that you could help us understand what types of emissions companies create. So some people have heard of this idea of the scopes 1, 2, and 3. I'm wondering if you could just both definitionally and how you think about them, relative importance. What is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and how might we want to be thinking about it?
Sure. The first part of greenhouse gas accounting is defining your boundaries as an organization. And for most companies that they have a certain set of facilities and maybe a fleet, it's relatively well managed, but there can be cases in terms of like where ownership's not clear that it's a little nebulous. So scope 1 are the emissions that come directly out of your operations, which are largely your facilities and fleets, like literally emissions out of smokestacks and tailpipes for the most part, and fugitive refrigerants. Scope 2 are indirect emissions. And for most organizations, the main and the only scope 2 emission is electricity. And the idea there is that you are making decisions on site that dictate how much electricity you're using, but the emissions don't happen at your site. They happen at the other end of the wires at the power plant. And then scope 3 is sort of the everything else category, but it's basically everything throughout your value chain kind of beyond your boundaries. So if you look upstream to wherever you're sourcing raw ingredients or raw materials or ingredients, the different energies and emissions that happen at those sites and facilities, the transportation it takes to get to your sites, ancillary emissions like packaging, which is sort of another thing you're purchasing and has a footprint. And then there's also the downstream impact if you're shipping product to a customer, as well as kind of the use and the end of life of that product. And so not all companies are product companies, but even with service companies, you're using data centers, you're generating waste that gets carried off sites. And business travel and employee commute are common categories of scope 3 that need to be accounted. And if you look at the greenhouse gas protocol, there's basically 15 categories of scope 3. So it does get confusing, but it is pretty comprehensively trying to take or make an assessment of the impact of your activities as an organization.
And so I imagine, and this is true of my lived experience working with different entities, organizations, companies, is that scope one, as soon as you draw the boundary, scope one may be pretty straightforward. Might be easy to estimate and then to measure. Once you get your head around it, it could be not necessarily too difficult. Scope two, if it is just electricity, oftentimes, depending on the provider of electricity, might be able to provide you with that information. So it's just a matter of gathering data. But my lived experience is that scope three can be difficult, that a lot of companies get hung up and they stop because of the complexity. Is that true of your experience, or how do you help a company dig into that, into scope three, to really get on the scale?
Exactly. That is an issue. And I think the main benefit with scope one and scope two, a lot of those impacts show up neatly on a utility bill. So it's like you're buying natural gas, which is the major scope one, or the scope two electricity. So it's pretty easily measured, and we can measure the grid pretty well. With scope three, one of the largest categories, as I just mentioned, there are 15 categories, is purchased goods and services. So if you're a food processing company and you're purchasing a bunch of ingredients, you have to come up with the footprint of that. And both because you don't control the boundaries of those facilities, it's harder to get the information. When you're looking at the farm level of impact, some things like diesel would be relatively easy to measure, but then you can start to get into complex soil dynamics and trying to figure out, okay, if I put fertilizer on a soil, how much nitrous oxide is generated, because nitrous oxide is a form of greenhouse gases. For rice farming, rice generates methane, but who's measuring methane in the same way that you're measuring natural gas and electricity? It just gets pretty complex, can get site-specific in those categories. And that category in particular, I think, is the one that gives a lot of companies challenges. There are multiple ways to address that. But before I do that, I should say other areas of scope three are more straightforward than others, like business travel. You can have receipts from gas stations for your cars. If you have plane tickets, those sorts of things are relatively tracked. And with commuting, you could survey your employees. So it's still a little harder because, again, it's not information that shows up on a utility bill, but it's a little more tractable to kind of get some results than some of the other means.
And so a company puts all this information together. So they have their scope one, their scope two, and so they endeavor through research, discovery, tracking, get to their scope three emissions. So now they kind of know their collective footprint through scopes one through three. What does a company do then? So now they're on the scale. I want to come to offsets as a whole category, but like, what's some of the first things that come to mind once you have a company that's on the scale? How do you help them get towards climate positive from that point?
I mean, that's really driven by the inventory. And that, to me, I mean, I do carbon footprint analytics, but part of the reason I do it is because it's the first part of really getting that understanding. And when you do that, then you can actually see your scope one, scope two, scope three contributions. For many companies, scope three is dominance, although for companies that are closer to being extractive industries and like further upstream, their scope one, scope two can end up being significant. And depending on that, then that drives kind of where you take action. So if gas and electricity are prominent, you can look at efficiency measures. Electricity is particularly, well, I don't want to say easy, but it's easier than other aspects of your footprint to address because there are different ways of purchasing renewable energy. You can do on-site renewables. You can use utility programs to buy clean energy. Similar to the offset markets, there's a renewable energy credits market that programs will allow you to purchase and kind of claim credit for renewable energy. We could have maybe a conversation on like how good that is. It is sort of similar to the offset market in a way, but it is considered a strategy. Beyond that, I find one really valuable measure on scope three is actually incorporated recycled content into packaging and products that can often have a significant impact. If you're doing a freight by air, that's actually a big footprint. So you can look at through some extra planning, it can take a little longer, but to use ship or rail or even road is going to be better than air. But there are times because of timelines or deadlines or not inability to plan that sometimes companies have to use air freight depending on the nature of their product. So it all really depends on the relative contributions of these different things to the overall footprint.
I see. So you help guide a company through, once they're on the scale, you can compare the relative contribution of the different aspects and then prioritize action. But the actions can run pretty deep, so there's certain choices that might be easy, but it could also involve actually changing the entire nature of the supply chain and looking at a more local, for example, supply chain or ground transport. So the consequences could be pretty big in the long run. So I imagine a lot of companies ask you, and I know it's in the book, so this question like kind of and I'm sure it's diverse for each company, it's different, but they might say, what's the best bang for my buck? Like, what's the highest leverage investments I can make? How do you typically respond to that when a company investment manager or CFO or leadership is looking to make some of those types of decisions?
Part of it is doing kind of more of a comprehensive cost analysis once you have those actions defined. So in the previous conversation, I guess I was making statements that I'm realizing just based on background information I have that actions that improve it, that it can improve your footprint, like incorporating recycled content or adding renewables. But then with that, to really get those to investment grade projects, you just have to do the work of understanding what the cost is. And not only understanding first cost, but actually understanding payment over time. So for renewables, if you're doing on-site renewables or building those off-site, those tend to be relatively expensive compared with the other types of renewables you could procure, like I was talking about, like working with the utility green energy program or buying RECs. But they actually have a financial return in a way that just buying credit for things doesn't, because that's sort of money that goes out the window. So when you do that, you can start to have a conversation on, okay, we're looking at this portfolio of actions, 12 projects, maybe over the next 3 years. They have different levels of initial investment that's needed from us as a company. And maybe we can get creative about financing to find other ways to generate that, as you can with renewables, for example. And then you'll have different returns. And part of the arts is just kind of having an honest conversation about, how much do we have to invest? What sort of return do we want? And what do we think of the value of these different projects? Are there other reasons that we should kind of undertake what we're planning?
Great. So you help the company sharpen the pencil, do a good, rigorous financial analysis once they know what the actions would be. And it's not just finances, I heard you just say. You look at the cascading impacts that might also be of benefit either to society, the purpose, or the mission of the organization, or benefit the company in maybe ancillary ways, but still measurable and important ways. I want to get to the offsets because I know it's a burning question for some people, but I do want to go through this financial analysis, best bang for the buck. Actually, let's go to offsets and RECs. So are there, in the book you say like good or bad, and we've had people ask us this question. Is there a difference in the type of offsets out there? Are they a good thing? Are they a bad thing? I know you have a very discerning perspective on it, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, and let me maybe step back when we're talking about net zero. If I was defining a climate positive business, that's a company that has a net zero goal, but is also committed to a science-based target. The science-based target is critical because and there's probably 1,900 companies, a lot of them actually multinationals or larger companies that have committed to science-based targets. That's basically driven by the Paris Agreement. Our best understanding of the science is saying that we need to make dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Then setting goals any less ambitious than that as a company doesn't make sense. And basically setting a science-based target will result in kind of a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases over 12 years. This is a rough translation. They talk about like 1.5 degree compliant and less than 2 degrees, but basically it's 50% over 20 years. That's what's more actionable. So the science-based targets requires actual reductions, so you can't use offsets. So part of it comes from that understanding of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The other value of science-based targets incentivizes early action because the targets are they're currently 5 to 15 years. Actually, next year they're changing the standard, so it has to be the first 5 to 10 years. Because we know we need reductions early, and a lot of net zero goals end up being the 2040, 2050 range. And the concern there is companies would just sort of, sit by the side for 15 years and not worry about it for 2035. So that's part of the value of science-based targets and not allowing offsets. So them just taking offsets a little more squarely. I think offset projects kind of have a value they can provide, but you need to be discerning about what you're counting on them to do. And science-based targets is now looking at kind of like longer term. So they just last month set their own definition of net zero. I mean, some of the concerns that you'll see in the discussions about it is one is additionality. So if people are putting money, rather than reducing their own emissions, are putting money into reforestation or renewable energy, the sense of additionality is, would this project have happened otherwise? That's one concern because sometimes you don't always know if you're just putting money into some other project. A second concern is how permanent the carbon removal is. If you're doing an offset project in trees in California, we have wildfires all the time here. So all your carbon savings could literally go up in smoke. I guess I understand some of the offset programs actually require reserves to maybe, it's essentially insurance, like having 30% more go into it. So if something like that does happen, there's money left to kind of replant, but it is a concern. Another is leakage. So if we have a nature-based offset project, say, where you're protecting a certain amount of land, was the pressure to harvest that land for timber or take it for farm, does that just go to another site? You're not really reducing it overall because that market pressure is still there. You just shifted it someplace else. So I think because of these issues where you don't have like guaranteed savings, there's it's effectively just it's a higher risk strategy. If we think of, well, we need to make this level of reductions, offsets come with sort of a certain level of risk that they may not deliver the carbon savings that were promised. But if you're trying to be a proactive company and you know in 2021 that you can't offset, you can't address all of your emissions and you want to do something about it, you can make a case for investing in offsets. And what I'd say is there should be benefit on that. So does it help kind of disadvantaged communities or under-resourced communities by helping address climate justice? With tree planting, you can get shade and habitat and kind of fruit and nut production. There's a lot of multiplicity of benefits where if a company is voluntarily choosing to do offset, plant trees, it's hard to argue against that, right? And that sort of brings up the context. I mean, there's voluntary versus involuntary markets. So California is one of the few places where large greenhouse gas polluters actually have to address their emissions. But if you're required to make a reduction, that's different than voluntarily. And my take on involuntary market is because of the risks. If you're really concerned that a company's not going to be able to reduce at an aggressive rate, I'd actually probably bias to like loosening the goal a little bit than count on offsets that may or may not deliver the same thing. It just complicates things too much compared with just simply measuring their emissions and making them reduce some amount, whether that's 40% or 50%.
Right. What I'm gathering is like the emphasis is on reductions. Like that's obviously where we need to be. But if we are looking at offsets, they might have a role to play. But like I heard you say, we need to be really discerning, looking at leakage, looking at additionality, looking at cascading benefits. And especially if it is in that voluntary kind of offset to back up some claims, but not necessarily related to SBT, the science-based targets, but just voluntary to back up claims, market claims, that even then we could do maybe even harm with offsets, but we could also do, there is potential to be beneficial, but it requires a level of interrogation and analysis, something like that. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, and it gets complex. You've probably heard about like overseas projects where they've been concerned about seizure of indigenous lands because now there's a market value placed on it. And from drawdown that actually indigenous land management is seen sort of a climate solution because these are the stewards of lands for generations and we need that land should kind of continue to keep its function. So if it gets seized through a market, from an offset market, that's kind of an undesired impact. And that sort of goes to only doing offsets in places where we know the good governance. But then this just sort of illustrates just sort of the levels of complexity it takes to like have a viable project that delivers the same results. And the reason you're doing this again is because you're having a hard time, reducing your natural gas combustion or whatever the aspect of your footprint that you can't tackle is.
That's what I'm afraid of, to be honest. It's just that when we look at the larger multinational corporations today, if they are sober in their analysis of kind of their emissions and where they need to go, it's likely to require for many of them a deep restructuring of their operations and potentially even their purpose, which are really big ideas and big things. And maybe I'm overly cynical, but I see a lot of the action today is important but inadequate to the transformation that's needed, but super important.
And then that's sort of the flip side of that. I keep wanting someone to do analysis. So if all the companies that have set net zero goals, it's a lot of big companies, all want to just do offsets, are there literally that much offsets on the planet to actually to address the issue?
Right. Yeah.
Because I'm not sure there are.
Right. The inventory of possible action. So reductions has to be the emphasis, and both at a societal level and within an organization. Yeah, there's some courage there amongst the individuals, but also systemically, I think. Maybe I'll ask you that. How are you feeling in terms of, we're just about to go into COP, the council partners again here as we're recording this. How are you looking at the standards bodies, and are you optimistic, or are you feeling that there's still a bit of inadequacy in how we're kind of defining the actions that need to happen. How are you feeling about that?
You're saying that for international policy, COP specific?
Policy in general. I'm just thinking from the climate policy at large, which obviously is diverse and has both global and regional character. One of my concerns is with the corporate co-option of policy or influence, I guess, to be more diplomatic, that corporate influence on policy is that the science is saying one thing, but the policy has been a little bit milquetoast in terms of actually defining what needs to be done. And so corporations are just essentially defining their actions on a least common denominator, like what's the lowest level of activity that's actually needed to be done. But the promise has always been that policy will become more stringent and more in alignment with the science. And I'm wondering just how you're tracking that, how you feel about that. Are you optimistic, or maybe it's an unfair question, David, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, no, it's a good question. And I actually feel like there's about 4 different directions kind of we could go in with it. But I mean, to start, I've been really focused sort of on the business angle because the business case is pretty clear for any company that's kind of looking at it beyond whatever a policymaker tells them. So just kind of latching on to science-based targets and net zero, the momentum that those movements have and helping show a clear path is kind of really where I've been focused. That said, I think anyone looking at the issue clearly says policy is inadequate because we're at where we're at in terms of 70 more parts per million in the air than there should have been. And we've had signals on this for decades. Probably honestly what's most disappointing to me, just because also in this moment we're on this infrastructure and reconciliation discussion within the US. And the fact that in 2021, kind of these climate initiatives are still sort of seen as partisan. We're well past the time that any of these, what are inherently bipartisan issues, can be bipartisan. And one thing I know we really need to do is sort of transcend this sort of Democrat versus Republican that tends to shut off open minds and just really ossify any kind of legitimate measures there. The fact that Joe Manchin has effective control over the process from a coal state and someone who's getting money from coal companies and has for the last couple of decades is clearly a concern too. I certainly relate to, I think, the concern on corporate influence. There are a lot of, it's actually tech companies that have been making kind of bold claims, but I've seen a lot of people calling that on policy because 2 organizations that they'll often support, U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Business Roundtable, have been advocating kind of against sort of kind of climate measures. So we often see companies that even with good intentions, sometimes their lobbying arm is sort of like out of sync with their sustainability group. I'm afraid I don't have an answer there.
No,
I have a problem definition.
Yeah, and I think defining it is good and helps bring a sobriety to the conversation. And, once we understand it more, we can find out where the levers we want to pull on for systems change and, where we have agency to make change.
Sobriety is important, I think. It's easy to get sort of starry-eyed about, Microsoft says they're going to be carbon neutral and have $1 billion fund by 2030, so they're all just going to figure it out. I mean, this stuff is not easy. I have a book that sort of walks through the process. There's kind of like, a lot of hard decisions and kind of data crunching that needs to happen to make good decisions. And I think, being clear-eyed about that is important.
You mentioned something that I think is definitely in the equation, but left off the balance sheet frequently is some of these, sometimes it is included, but is these kind of cascading areas. In the book, you highlight at least 2 of them. More than this, you highlight more of them, but you do specifically call out water and you call out biodiversity. Anything you want to say there in terms of, because there's this tendency that I see of like carbon reductionism or GHG reductionism when we're talking about climate, but we're not just in a climate crisis. Obviously, we're in a biodiversity crisis. We're in a freshwater crisis, a soil crisis, the stack. And your book does address this, but how do you help companies put that into their calculus? Or what are your thoughts on this cascading or adjacent impact areas?
You're right in climate action that we should be thinking holistically. One example that comes to mind is in different cleaning processes you might have in a plant. You might have a choice between a water-intensive process and energy-intensive process because you can kind of change those things in different ways. They can be exchangeable. If you're just pursuing a climate goal, the one that's energy-intensive is going to look bad. So that might influence you to look at the water one. But if you live in a drought-stricken area, I'd still submit that the water-intensive process is actually a bad choice. So making sure that you're kind of checking for trade-offs is important. in the same way that you don't want to clear natural lands to put in regenerative agriculture. You have like functioning ecosystems that are having real climate benefit. So disrupting that benefit to create other projects doesn't make sense. Well, I've known one project, but that's one project too many for like a large solar array that was clearing out a bunch of trees. Like there's plenty of open space and developed land where we can kind of put that. So I am trying to encourage others to kind of think holistically about impacts on water, on biodiversity, on under-resourced communities, because ultimately doing things kind of the wrong way will be a PR disaster, as much as a PR disaster as is not kind of hitting climate goals or not helping us get to the level of greenhouse gas emission reductions that we need to achieve.
Thanks, David. So thinking about it holistically is important. This might be going back in the conversation, but I thought it was fun or interesting. One of the labels in the book, in the chapter subheadings, you mentioned this term, zombie carbon. I'm wondering if you could define that for and where it fits into how you help companies when they're considering both their targets and their actions.
When we talked about scope 3, we were talking about purchased goods and services and the fact that there's this whole chain of events upstream from your organization that create greenhouse gas emissions. That's effectively zombie carbon. So by the time something reaches your facility, it still has a carbon footprint. The building community refers to it as embodied carbon. I was just kind of having some kind of fun with the concept. But in buildings, because sometimes there's a push for more energy efficient buildings, I think when people were researching into the impact of concrete and steel in particular, and just seeing that these had sort of a high footprint, it made people kind of think a little differently about the fact that, well, I do want this more energy efficient building, but basically it's going to need to operate 30 or 40 years to like offset the embodied carbon. The carbon will save. It'll take 40 years to get that to offset so the embodied carbon materials that went into it. So we need to think about this a little more carefully. One thing I should say probably is I think in making better decisions, one is sort of a substitution. It's like, well, if steel's carbon intensive, I guess I'm going to use something else. But substitution can only get you so far. For real success on climate, companies are going beyond their own boundaries and doing a lot of kind of value chain collaboration. So working with suppliers that if there's a supplier with kind of a high carbon footprint, actually work with them to install renewables, do efficiency at their own facilities in the same way you're working on your own. And that way, what they provide you is that much less carbon intensive. So that's going to be one emerging and increasing way that I see companies will be addressing zombie carbon and all these upstream impacts that generate greenhouse gas reductions for what is often kind of their largest contributor to things they're purchasing in that scope 3.
I think it's right. So sometimes what I'm hearing you say is sometimes substitution is not possible, or at least fraught, or maybe financially untenable. And so actually collaborating in these supply webs is going to be one of the areas of action that your clients will be taking and that you'll be helping them through.
Exactly. And it's already happening. It's been happening, but it's only going to increase now that so many more companies are looking at their scope 3.
Maybe there's a business leader, organization leader listening to this right now, and we may have covered this already, so forgive the redundancy, but how would you guide them? What do they do first? What are the basic outline of the steps towards becoming climate positive, just so that they could say, oh yeah, I can take action here. I know what the first thing is. How would you answer that for them? How would you give them some guidance?
That's always worth recapping. So we had said before, do your inventory of the different types of emissions so you know where your big impacts are. From that, after you identify kind of the areas of largest contribution, look at actions to reduce that, and then start to implement. So whether it's putting budgets together, having staff kind of look at it a little more closely to determine kind of what can be done. And especially if like in manufacturing, it can be sort of complex in terms of like figuring out how something kind of works with the existing process. But allocating kind of resources to kind of making those investments is important. And then when you have that baseline and some actions, one thing I end up doing a lot for companies that are looking at goals like the science-based target is taking their portfolio of actions and then helping them see, okay, well, if we're going to implement these 12 things over the next 8 years, how close does that get to our target? So it's essentially sort of forecasting the greenhouse gas emission reductions based on what you know. So that I think is an important piece. And then also a big piece is the financial analysis around the portfolio of action. So understanding kind of investments, But doing it more holistically. I think when I was talking before, I was pretty focused on the financial piece, because if you're running a business, that is going to be pretty important. But I think you do need to look at other things. And one thing, honestly, we're pushing against is that natural gas, for example, is like very cheap. And you can argue, well, the market price is lying because there's a carbon impact that's not being accounted for. And another emerging practice in that financial analysis is to actually have your own sort of internal price on carbon, essentially, which you can justify because if you're going to buy something like offsets, reducing your emissions actually saves you that cost. And offsets are also relatively cheap per carbon, but it starts to help do the financial analysis in sort of a more holistic way. And that would be sort of that is something that I think business owners should look at, as well as doing, inventory action identification, and then, projection financial analysis to see, how well they will make it toward the target.
That's very clear. That's something that if an organization exists today, even small, medium-sized organization, if you haven't been up to the large ones, that seems like the almost table stakes to be an organization in society today. If you're going to be contributing to meeting human needs in the economy, is we actually need to take exactly what you said, each one of those steps along the way, doing that analysis, and then, of course, taking action pursuant to the results of what comes out from that type of analysis. I'm glad you're around to help companies do that.
I've been working with, medium, larger companies often, but I'm guessing you find this in your work too, that increasingly startups are looking at trying to figure out how they bake that in to get it right from the outset.
Exactly. And much easier, much easier to bake it in from the outset. There's still difficulty sometimes finding the right supply, the right ingredient, etc. But disentangling some of the web that exists can be extra challenging.
Yeah, I was going to say, unwinding tens of millions of investment in some system that is no longer serving you.
As you're tracking out there, I'm curious, what are you most excited about? What are you inspired by? And also, maybe related or not, what's next for you in your work?
What I find exciting is just the level of interest in this space as someone who's been working on climate with businesses for 15 years. There has been an explosion in business interest in kind of tackling greenhouse gas footprint. I think this interest objectively had been building over many years, but there's been a perceptible shift just in the last few years. And I attribute much of that to the upsurge in investors encouraged about ESG metrics and performance. I'd also be interested in kind of your thoughts on this too, but from what I've seen, those holding the purse strings are now keenly interested in the social environmental impacts of their investments. And that has gotten attention in a very different way from company leadership and boards than even was the case probably 5 years ago. It has been exciting to see that. I'm also certainly excited about my book that just came out this month. Any listeners of this podcast are welcome to a 20% discount that hopefully you can get sort of in the show notes. But it's available from Routledge.com. So ROUTLEDGE.com. And the title of the book is Climate Positive Business, How You and Your Company Hit Bold Climate Goals and Go Net Zero. Beyond that, honestly, I think I'm just trying to stay the course. I've better crystallized what I've done over the last few years and focused really on helping businesses on climate strategy and carbon footprint analytics. And that has become my reason for existence. Pleasure to be here with you on the show and have a chance to kind of talk about it further.
Thank you, David. The rigor it takes to do some of the analysis that I know you do, from the detailed work you did at Project Drawdown and some of the clients that we've maybe mutually talked about or maybe worked with at Lift Economy and through your consulting, it's not the most sometimes glorified work. It's, some of the analysis is very detailed and difficult. And I really appreciate you for having the stamina to not only do the detailed work, which is rigorous and comprehensive, presented in a way that's understandable and meaningful for action. But I also, and maybe it doesn't shine through in this conversation because we talked about the book and a lot of that consulting work, but you also have a justice lens that you bring to your work, that your commitment to a more just and equitable world, it carries through not only your work, but your personal life. And that both and of being able to be in the trenches doing the detailed work with corporations to turn the tide, which is essential, but also doing the more direct work in your own life and community in service of a more just and equitable society. I think it's really important that we as humans could demonstrate that we could straddle those. And I've always admired your ability to do both at the same time.
I appreciate that, Kevin. And I think I'd say the same about you and pretty much everyone I've met through Lift Economy. I think it's about people used to use the term work-life balance. I prefer work-life integration because I feel like work should support you in kind of multiple ways and not be depleting. But I think you can see, whether you want to look at it from a lens of justice, health, or whatever, there's a certain amount of things that need to happen. And different communities resonate differently to different messages. So I think understanding what some of the motivations are in business and kind of helping businesses drive forward to the world I think that we collectively want to see, irrespective of what the politicians think, I think that's important.
So important. Well, David, I'm really grateful for you, for the work that you're doing. I'm excited for your book. I hope listeners get excited about it, and I hope they reach out to you and connect. There's a lot that you've shared today, helping us understand the landscape for how businesses can become climate positive. Thanks for your time on Next Economy Now. I'm sure we'll reach back out to you another time later and go deeper into the conversation as your work continues to evolve.
Thank you, Kevin. All my best.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.